Welcome to the Teach Me Lit podcast. I'm Sophie Tuvey and I love talking about books and helping you to revise for English literature and go deeper in the texts you're studying.
Change is at the heart of North and South. How far do you agree? Well, in many ways, as Malthusian argues, this novel is a story of change, religious, economic, social and psychological. And I love the way that the whole novel is shaped around the Bildungsroman structure of Margaret's change from innocence to experience, from naivety to maturity, and very much we follow Margaret make that journey of change. And I think a key thing for this kind of exam question is to really track Margaret's changing character at key marker points in the text. So you might want to look at some of the early chapters, such as chapter 3, where Margaret says to her mother she doesn't want to socialise with the Gormans because they're shoppy people. They make their money through trade. And she's quite snobby about that. And then really when Margaret gets to Milton and she gets to know the Higgins family, and through the Higginses she hears about the Bouchers and their poverty, this really challenges Margaret, because in Helston she was aware of people in poverty, but she saw herself as a good lady of the South, as Malthusian points out. You know, she saw herself as someone who in a somewhat patronising way would turn up with a basket of food to hand over and then go back to her normal life. Now, Nicholas doesn't want a relationship with Margaret on that kind of footing. Essentially, he says, if you're going to visit, you're going to visit as a friend. He doesn't want pity. But Margaret feels increasingly challenged at her own level of privilege when she sees Bessie, who is 19 years old, dying because of the fluff that's got into her lungs from factory work. And the two of them are juxtaposed, and I think Gaskell very deliberately creates that contrast, that Bessie is dying just as Margaret's life is beginning. And that influences Margaret's attitude beyond a mere sympathy for the poor. I think it makes her aware of her own privilege, and she begins to want to get involved in people's lives in a much more real, tangible way, which we know Gaskell herself did as a Unitarian minister's wife in Manchester. She very much went into people's homes, spoke to them and worked with them, and she didn't just see them as projects. She was passionate about people and about social change. I think we really see Margaret as a voice piece for Gaskell in this text. Now, ultimately, there are two sides to Margaret's development, because in terms of her development, in her understanding of how society works, through the Higginses she particularly starts to understand things like striking, and through hearing Nicholas speak about the union, what the union means to him, what the union's trying to achieve, she sees that essentially there is a key problem, and the problem is lack of communication between the masters and the men. And she comments, to Thornton, I see two classes dependent on each other in every possible way. And Margaret sees, as an outsider to the situation, how detrimental it is that basically the masters and the men are at war with each other, to the detriment of both. And through the novel, we not only see how the workers suffer, but we also see Thornton suffer as well, because business is hard for him too. So Margaret has this growing understanding of social economy, really, and how the world works, and is then able to develop more realistic solutions. The idea of communication, and of course it's Nicholas who comes up with this idea of the canteen, that Thornton can provide food with his workers, and Thornton very much approaches Nicholas to help him implement that idea in a way that the workers will accept. There's another element to Margaret's character, though, that develops, and this is mainly to do with Thornton, because one of the big sticking points is that Margaret refuses to see Thornton as a gentleman. It's one of the reasons why he takes so much offence at her. He comments to his mother that she looked at him as if he were an unwashed vassal, and, you know, she was like an empress draped in her shawl. And I think he felt a keen sense of his own inferiority. And she did not see him as a gentleman because he lacked the education that she would expect in one of her own social class. Really, what has to happen to Margaret is she has to appreciate Thornton over the course of the novel, his character, his commitment to doing what's right, his ability to admit his own mistakes and change, and how actually he is the true gentleman. And I think she comes to that realization very gradually over the course of the text. Now, Thornton himself changes quite dramatically as well. So again, to support this idea of changes at the heart of North and South, we also have Thornton initially taking the position of a kind of capitalist person with almost Malthusian ideas about poverty. Now, Thomas Malthus wrote a highly influential paper in the Victorian era, really about the reasons behind poverty. And essentially, Malthus's idea was the population was always going to be out of control and too much. There was always going to be poverty. There was always going to be a lack of food. And essentially, what you had to do as a country is allow people to die. You had to allow the weak, allow the sick to self-regulate by, dying off in disease, and that you should not support people in poverty and make it easy for them to be poor. So that's why the Victorians passed this Poor Law Amendment Act, which basically meant that anyone who needed help had to go to a workhouse, and they knew that going to the workhouse meant their family would be broken up and put in separate places. They would be nearly starved. They would be put to hard manual labour. And of course, nobody wanted to go to the workhouse. It wasn't really a choice. And Charles Dickens wrote a lot about this in his novels like Oliver Twist, really depicting the horrible irony of people running the workhouse thinking they're doing a charitable endeavour when actually they're just slowly starving these poor orphans. So the Victorians had this idea that poverty was your own fault, and Thornton's kind of inherited that idea. He's got his own story to back this up, because in his own mind, he has managed through hard work and perseverance to raise himself from being, a boy in a draper's shop to the owner of a factory. It's worth saying that he couldn't have done that without the support of some of his father's old debtors taking note of him and helping him. But he is not very sympathetic in the early chapters when Margaret is talking about the responsibility of a master towards his men. As Pollard points out, Thornton is taking this position of an industrial autocrat. And because Margaret's position is that of the Christian socialist, we've got this great clash of ideologies between the two of them. And whereas Thornton's like, well, I shouldn't get involved in my workers' lives. It's their business what they do outside of work hours. Margaret says, yes, but you have a responsibility before God to look after your men and your workers and make sure that they are, they understand why you're paying them the rate you're paying them. And gradually, of course, Thornton does appreciate Margaret's point of view. And really this happens through Higgins, because Margaret sends Higgins to Thornton to ask him for work when no one else will hire him after the strike because of his association with the union. And he's trying to support Boucher's children because Boucher's committed suicide, and he feels this is his fault and his responsibility to care for them. And initially Thornton dismisses Higgins, but then when he hears that Higgins had waited for him for 5 hours outside, he then visits Higgins's house and he sees Boucher's children there, so he realises that Higgins was telling him the truth. And he apologises, he backs down and he says, I will offer you this job, and from there that marks a big turning point, because it shows Thornton's willingness to back down, and Higgins works with him to help him understand the plight of his workers in more depth. So we see both Thornton and Margaret change a lot, and particularly at the end when Thornton, his business is in ruins. He's lost a lot of money. He goes to this dinner and he's very honest about the fact that his business has failed. But he says, he was just beginning to do things right, and he wants to, in the future, speak to his men, communicate with them, make sure everything's working on a very different basis to how he was describing earlier in the novel. So we can see that Thornton has completely changed. And then what happens really skillfully in the structure of the novel is that as Margaret and Thornton finally become united in an engagement at the end, these two threads really combine. And as Pollard says, the love of Thornton and Margaret symbolises both the union of North and South and the completion of their respective individual enlightenments. So the idea that they've both been on an inner journey of looking to change, and Margaret is able at the end to offer Thornton this financial sponsorship to go back to his factory, to go back to his workers. And it's again a sign of Thornton's humility that he accepts the offer. So we've got this lovely structure where the two characters are developed and changed, and then they are allowed to come back together in unity at the end, and their unity symbolises a bigger unity that the novel's been all about. The title, North and South, suggests this binary opposition. It suggests that the novel is about the contrast between the industrial North and the wealth of the South, the very different cultures in Milton and Helston and London. It suggests that even Thornton and Margaret are polar opposites and their differences can never be reconciled. But actually, the point of the novel is that they can. And I think obviously it's following a romance plot as well, so you're getting the happy ending of the engagement between the two main characters. But you've got a sense in which they are very different people at the end to what they were at the beginning. Margaret has come to maturity. She's learned to take control of her own life, and she's very much in a position now of financial independence where she's now refusing to let Aunt Shaw make decisions for her. She's not going to stay in London in this kind of lazy environment that she now no longer values. She wants to make a difference with her money, which is why she offers Thornton the financial sponsorship, the business proposition she gives him. In a sense as well, Thornton and Margaret each represent an aspect of Victorian society that is changing anyway. Margaret is like this new woman becoming independent and representing how women's rights were developing. And John Thornton is this idea of, the middle class man, the middle class gentleman developing, somebody who can better himself through education and through growing into the middle class, not from birth. So really, yes, change is absolutely at the heart of this novel, and you can trace how Gaskell very skillfully weaves it through the entire structure, but brings about a powerful resolution at the end.
If you've enjoyed this podcast and found it helpful, please hit subscribe and share it with a friend. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter. Just search for Teach Me Lit. I'm always open to requests, so if you want me to talk about a text you're studying, get in touch. Thank you for listening. See you next time on the Teach Me Lit podcast.